Please consider becoming a patron of MythVision Podcast. You'll get early access to every video, including this amazing one, and you can ask me personal questions, private message me, anything you'd like. Professor Joel Baden, do I exist?
People can't see you on the camera. You're just a voice right now.
That's true. I'm the voice in your head. Scholarship 50 years ago wouldn't have dreamed of saying Abraham didn't exist. It seems like the fringe crazies came out of the woodwork and said, this guy probably didn't exist. And I'm only estimating, I'm just throwing a number out there, that at some point in the distant past, this was not even something entertained, but maybe a minimal understanding of him, but not the guy didn't exist. But now it seems to be that shift in scholarship has happened, and they think most likely Abraham's fictitious. What are your thoughts? I'm going to hip fire like characters. We'll just have like a fictional character video with you, or fictional or historical, and you can give us your like.
Okay, can I start with a caveat?
Please.
There's a difference between didn't exist at all and the biblical accounts of have nothing to do with a person, whether or not that person actually existed. In other words, I can imagine writing an entire novel about George Washington that had no connection at all, with anything true about George Washington. But that didn't mean George Washington didn't exist.
Okay.
Right? So there's a world in which a character, a biblical character, is not real. But there's like something in the past that may have given rise to all of the stuff we find in the Bible, all of which is so far removed from reality that it becomes not real.
And
okay?
I think that
I don't know how I'm gonna mark that, whether it's as fact or fiction, but I'll give initial responses and then qualify them.
I would like to also add my own caveat on this, because I think it's important. There are going to be skeptics who might hear your answer, right? And then go, well, I need the physical, he didn't exist if you can't prove that there's this guy who existed, right? And I think that oftentimes skeptics go too far without granting what you're actually suggesting and what you just said as your caveat, because that happens.
And you have to remember, if that were your basis for saying stuff, then we could prove. Who could we prove existed from 3,000 years ago? Like, only the people whose bones we've found? Because, like, people weren't leaving, like, we don't have, like, their tax records, right? We don't have written evidence of 99.9999% of human beings. Like, and if you're going to tell me that the written records we do have don't count, then, like, what counts as proof that people existed?
Thank you.
At that point, you're, like, dealing with, like, I guess nobody existed, because... like, someone had to exist, right? There had to be people. So there's a line there. Okay.
I thank you for making that point, and I just wanted to clarify too, for the sake of those who are watching this. Did Adam exist?
No.
And you would like
stop. End of conversation.
All right.
The other thing I'll add to this is, like, again, right? We're talking about people existing, and we're going to ask questions about the biblical stories about these people. It's sort of acting as if there's one biblical story about the people. But again, if I tell you that, like, like Abraham in J and Abraham in P and Abraham in E all have different stories told about them and, like, different characteristics and come from different places and, like, live in different spaces, and, like, what does it even mean? Is it like real or not? Like, at that point, you have to only talk about, like, could there be something in the past that was like a basis for a tradition or a... Anyway, go ahead.
No, this is wonderful. This gets us closer to the point, right? And I really do appreciate that, because when I said Adam, you didn't say, well, in maybe possible source here. No, I think that is a mythic...
there's a line, right? Like, the idea of, like, the first dude, I think we can safely set aside.
Right. Cain, Abel?
No.
What do they represent? They're probably nations, right?
No, people like to associate Cain with like this Kenite, a nation of sort of like Cain descendants called the Kenites that live down to the south. I'm not particularly care about that. Cain and Abel. It's a mythological story. Like it doesn't have to represent a lot. There's something to do there, maybe with agricultural versus pastoralists. It's like none of them are convinced. Nothing is convincing me. Is like, oh, the story is really code for whatever, right? Like there's got a bunch of things going on. It's a myth, right? Myths have different moving parts, right? There's some historical reference, there's some cultural reference, right? You can do it with this Greek myth too, right? Like, what does that Greek myth represent? What is it really? Like, well, yes, it's about agriculture and it's about the seasons, and it's also about these characters that exist in this greater like mythological world, and it's also so it's a lot of things. Anyway, Cain and Abel aren't real.
So Enoch lived 365 years.
Definitely.
Okay.
And every year was a day, and they were all spectacular. No.
Enoch?
No.
Okay.
No, stop. There's like nothing. You
you know what I'm doing.
Noah, nothing.
Right.
Like, nope.
And I figure it's based on Apkallu, possibly. You read a text or something with Enoch. I'm just speculating there, but
sure. I mean, you're really heavily into Genesis 1 through 11. We're in the full mythological. Like none of that's going to have a person.
Thank you for clarifying.
An actual historical, an actual living person that we can even get back to at all, right?
So then let's go to the patriarch himself.
Abraham.
The infamous name Abraham. Yeah. Abram, but then Abraham. Yeah.
So this is the first one where it's really easy to say like no, like, and again, this is the easy one. There's absolutely nothing in the biblical account that we can say is true of any human that ever lived. At the same time, what we're looking at in the Abraham and the Isaac and the Jacob stories are traditions that seem to be concentrated around certain areas of ancient Israel. So right, like Jacob's traditions are focused around Bethel, right? That's his like home area, and Abraham is around Hebron, and Isaac is around Beersheba, right? Like their stories take place in these places, which suggests that these are stories that were told by people who lived there. So right, the Abraham stories probably originally were passed down by people who lived down in the south in the Hebron area, and who were like, yes, we live here, and this is our place, and we are all descended from our ancestor Abraham, and why do we live here? Because God gave the land to our ancestor Abraham, and that's why we're here today, right? And like, none of that is true either, but like, at some point, maybe there was like some tribal ancestor who first settled there. Mm-hmm. And they were like, this is my land. Whose name may or may not be Abraham. Like, I claim this land for myself. And then generations of their descendants lived there, and the stories grew, and the myths about their ancestor grew, until we had like whole complexes and stories and international relations and all this and the other. So was Abraham real or not? Not. Can I imagine there having been an ancestral figure for that tribal group in that particular region? That's not the Abraham of the Bible. It's like some dude who planted his flag on a piece of land and was like, I'm gonna sit here now. That's the truth that I'm willing to grant.
Right.
I don't know that his name was Abraham. I don't know anything about him. I don't know that that's even true. But that's like as far as I'm willing to go. So like it's right. That's really on the edge of like, fact or fiction. Like the Abraham story is fiction. Right. The character of Abraham is fictional.
Right.
I'm not going to give up on the possibility that there is some kernel of something back in a tradition somewhere that resembles nothing like what we have now, but was generative for them.
Thank you. So Abraham,
Isaac,
Jacob, and
way.
Then Joseph. Joseph is a strange guy he's connected into Egypt. You would say that's also kind of in the same vein.
Again, the story has got nothing to do with anything.
Okay.
Right? The story, there's no truth behind the story. But again, Joseph is a name that is tied to a region, right? The region of Ephraim and Manasseh is like labeled like the house of Joseph. Same thing. I assume that we have tribal connections here, right? Is Ephraim real? Is Manasseh real? Not in the way they are in the Bible. Are those probably potentially the names of Could those be the names of like long ago tribal founders or like prominent people such that we became the people of Ephraim because we live in this territory? Sure. And could those people all be like, and we are the people of Joseph because we live in this territory because like we go back, there's another figure out there? Maybe. But like, again, there's no connection with what we have in the text whatsoever.
Okay. So now that we've gotten past the skin, if you will, maybe there's some meat to the bones on Moses. What are your thoughts on Moses?
Similar, but less. It's a similar answer, but it's a little bit, I don't know, meatier, to use your word, at the center of it. Again, not a single word in the Bible about Moses can be verified as historically accurate. Nothing. But the alternative, right? Then you might say something like, well, then I guess Moses is completely fictionalized, invented character by the Israelites who told this story. And there's some weird things about that. Like, if I'm going to invent a story about like my super awesome, like liberated me from slavery is our like one of our great national heroes, dude, I'd probably give him a name that's like my kind of name. Like an Israelite name, because he's supposed to be one of my people, instead of giving him like a thoroughly Egyptian name.
Right.
Right. So, and yeah, like there's the story in Exodus 2 about like, why is he named Moses? Right. Because it's found by the Pharaoh's daughter. But like, that's exactly what that story does. Exactly the thing I'm talking about. That story exists to explain why does our Israelite hero have an Egyptian name? Here's why. Like, and it's the whole roundabout story about how he got it. The name for me is something of a giveaway that perhaps there was a real raised in Egypt person who something Bible. You know what I mean? Like who, and it could be a million things, right? Like he could be like, Moses could just be like the guy who helped that one Semitic slave like get his freedom, like, and then like waved him at the border and was like, bye-bye, have a nice life. And like that dude was like, yes, I was freed by Moses, this Egyptian guy. Like, again, all it takes is a tiny kernel for like the whole like narrative, like in traditional world to explode. So my guess is that, again, nothing in the Bible about Moses is historically verifiable or even remotely plausible or true. Could there have been in history somebody with, and name probably wasn't even just Moses, right? Like Moses means son of, right? Like Ramesses is son of Ra, and Tutmosis is son of Thoth, and like anyway, like it's a you know, it's a weird thing to name a kid, just like son of, generic, like it'd be like naming your kid. But the Egyptian name of it does make me suspect that like someone brought with them perhaps a like legit memory of someone who had that name or something like it. And that's the kernel of the whole thing. So pretty far away from what the Bible tells, but a little closer than someone like Abraham.
Right.
Like we're edging ever so slowly closer towards potential historical reality.
So let's kind of do a broader here. In the entire history of Moses in the narrative of biblical, or Joshua, are there any encounters with historical people or they themselves potentially having a root that you're aware of? Okay. So let's skip the judges, unless you think there's some judges somewhere that actually have a history.
So the judges is a better one, right? The judges, again, you're just going to keep getting closer.
Right.
You're not going to get further. You're going to, for the most part. Maybe Samson. Like you're not going to get much further, right? When you get to like the story, when you get to like the story of Ehud, right? Like one of the first judges, like not important, but like it's got a nice chapter about him. He's the story about the one who stabs the dude in the bathroom, sitting on the toilet. Like it's a great story. I don't know why we don't tell that one in like Sunday school. But Ehud's got he's got a nice little story. He's one of the judges. There's a million judges. Like we've heard of a couple of them, but like. Most of them are like minor, but someone like Gideon or a Jephthah or a Ehud or even Deborah, etc. Like there's a Samson, but then the weird ones like Tola, who has one verse about him. Great. Are those real people? Again, I don't know that story about Ehud like stabbing the fat dude while he's sitting on the toilet is true. Probably not. But again, what we're looking at here, I think even more clearly, is like a local tale about a local hero. And so I'm totally willing to grant that like in a certain pocket of probably like the tribe of Benjamin, there was, there were people who told the story about their hero, right? Like it's George Washington chopped down the cherry tree, right? If all you had about George Washington was the story that he chopped down a cherry tree, it wouldn't be true. But George Washington would be true. We tell stories about him, right? I think the judges fall into that category, right? Like there was probably people who had positions of leadership around whom legends grew up. And some of the stories of the judges fall into that category. They were probably real people. That doesn't mean that what's in the Bible about them is historically true, right? So,
okay. King Saul.
Yeah, probably.
He's pretty human in so many respects when you read about him.
Right, but so is Jacob, right?
Okay.
Like the ability for the biblical story or narrator or text to like characterize doesn't actually tell us anything about whether they're real or not, right? Like in the same way that like the best novels today give you a character you're like that character is so real, but they're not, right? Like that's not.
What does it for you then? Like
it's we're just edging closer to like verifiable
extra
stuff.
biblical source to
like we get some like, and there's no extra biblical evidence of Saul,
right?
But there will be of David, which we're going to get to, I presume, in a second.
Sorry for the sirens.
It's okay. I'm saying some really heavy stuff, and they're coming for me. But like, Saul is a probably, and Saul's existence. My feeling on Saul's existence has a lot to do with my feelings about David's existence, because Saul exists in large part as part of David's story. So how I think about the David story and its construction and its sort of historical veracity impacts my view of Saul. But Saul is effectively prequel to David in a sense, and so
the John the Baptist of Jesus, so to speak.
Yeah. Like
maybe we talk about David then, because you wrote a whole book on this.
Yeah, it's easier in a sense to do David and then think about Saul. So people have been debating David for a long time, although mostly recently. As you said, like 50 years ago, nobody was debating David. And then people started debating David.
You're hurt. You're really.
I know. I'm really pissing everyone off. But David, the folks who tried to start saying that David didn't exist at all were people who we think about as biblical minimalists, right? People for whom the Bible as a whole is a later product with a political agenda, and David is a fully fanciful, like reconstructed, mythic, perfect king, right? Like who, becomes the embodiment of all the the hopes and dreams of this later people who want to return to the land and conquer it and all these things. Which was an okay position to hold for a while until in like the early 90s we found a piece of a stela, inscription from the 9th century that referred to the House of David. Now, you can have a House of David without there being a real David, but it's a little bit weird. It's a little weird in that kind of context, right? Like, why would the Arameans who carved this like talk about the house of a fictional? It didn't really make sense, and so they tried to like say that the stela was fake or like anyway. None of it panned out. So there's extra biblical evidence for at least the notion of a House of David. But my real issue in terms of the reality of David actually comes from the text itself. And this is mostly what the book I wrote is about, is like the way that the David story is told in Samuel and Kings. It's told in order to convince you that David was actually okay. Right? Like it's full of rhetorical devices and narrative tricks and characterizations that are meant to effectively cover up or, put a good spin, a positive spin on what looked like some pretty shady stuff, right? Like, so, we have Saul dies in battle against the Philistines, right? Saul's killed by Philistines. Where's David when that happens? even according to the Bible's own story, David is working for the Philistines when that happens. Who does Saul's crown go to as soon as Saul dies? It gets brought to David. Like, which is weird. Like, that's weird. Like, that makes sense if, I don't know, David helped the Philistines kill Saul in exchange for receiving Saul's crown. Like, that's a plausible explanation. The Bible's explanation is sort of implausible, right? That David was not in line for the throne at all, and that Saul just out of nowhere tried to kill him. And so David ran away and finally found himself with the Philistines, who he sort of like agreed to serve. But when the Philistines asked him to do stuff against the Israelites, he tricked them and didn't do it. And then when the Philistines went off to go fight against Saul, David like didn't go with them. And like the Bible tells us that he wasn't anywhere near there. Like he was all the way over here in this other part of the world. And then when Saul dies, some kid happens to randomly pick up his crown and out of nowhere, for no reason whatsoever, brings it to David, this runaway Philistine like helper guy who has no connection to anything, so that David has the crown. Like, none of that makes sense.
Right.
What it makes sense as is an attempt to be like, I know it looks bad, but. And the only time you have to say, I know it looks bad, but, is in the moment that it's happening, right? You don't spin stuff that happened hundreds of years ago. And I know this because I know what David's story looks like when it's told hundreds of years later, because I have Chronicles, which also tells the story of David, but is nowhere near David's time. So Chronicles tells me nothing negative about David. He's perfect. There's not even a hint of anything. There's no Bathsheba. There's no Absalom, right? Like, there's no, like, he doesn't kill, like, no involvement with the Philistines. None of the stuff that looks bad for David, even in Samuel and Kings, Chronicles doesn't tell any of it because there's no need to. Like, it can tell it however it wants. It tells the perfect David story. He was a perfect everything. Samuel and Kings reads like what the ancient genre we call the apology, right? Which is the same way we have apologetics now, right? Like, it's like, yeah, it doesn't look great, but I'm going to explain this stuff away, right? And just like modern day apologetics, it doesn't really work. But like, but it needs to be like, it needs to be present day focused. And we have other examples of ancient apologies written by kings who we knew existed that look a lot like the David story. They're like, yeah, okay, so I wasn't next in line for the throne, but like, you know, I was favored by the gods, and like the real king like just attacked me out of nowhere and I had to defend myself. And so like, that's how I ended up beating him. And now I'm sitting on the throne, and like, this is why. And like, it's not, I swear I didn't usurp the throne, right? Like, yeah. It just happened, which is very much what the David story does too, in terms of Saul. So if I think that's what's going on with David, is like, it's an in the moment, like, attempt to spin for all the people who out there who'd be like, you're not the legitimate king, right? You're like some kid who just like went to work for the Philistines and like took over Saul, like made a deal with the devil, and like now you're sitting in Saul's throne. Like, no, let me explain to you how it actually was. That's a very present day kind of thing. So spin implies a reality, right? You don't spin fiction, right? You spin real things, right? The thing I always say is, you know, like, we could do this, the reference changes all the time, but like, you know, was there a pandemic this past year? Or like, I don't even know if I say that. Like, depending on who you ask, right? Like, currently there is spin going on, right? Like, there's not a real pandemic, or there is a real pandemic, but it was caused by a lab. No, it was caused by China. It was caused, you know, like, all this, the way we talk about it, you know, that's all spin. Like, what's agreed on is that something bad happened. Something bad happened, yeah. Right? Same thing in the David story, right? There is an agreement that, like, yes, these things happen, but I'm going to spin them to make them go the way I want them to go. If spin implies reality, then there has to be some reality there. It's not what the Bible says. Right. It's what we can sort of extract as the logical background that explains why the Bible talks about David the way it does. Why does the Bible tell me that, like, David went to this dude's house, this super rich dude's house, and was like, and like walked away, and when he walked away, the guy was dead, and David was married to his wife and owned all his stuff. Like, that looks pretty bad. Yeah. The Bible explains to me why that's the case. Like, but that implies that, like, why would he even tell the story? right? Like if there wasn't a need to explain it away. If David is real in a non-exactly biblical sense, that implies a reality for Saul to a degree also.
Okay.
Once we get past that, once we get past David, I don't think we're into the realm of fictional characters anymore. We have external evidence for plenty of biblical kings, Omri, Jehu, like they're referred to by other people outside of the Bible itself.
Jehoiakim, yeah.
I mean, plenty of them.
I was going to ask you one last, since you gave us the hot seat for the rest, we kind of have the gist that they're there. Even if there's like fiction about them or like spinning about these kings, whatever it might be.
Remember, the biblical story of these kings is not
right.
It is not historically true necessarily.
Right.
But did they exist? For sure they existed.
So Solomon is a tricky question because I actually have Russell Gamirkan, and we'll do a video just getting your response and ideas about minimalism in light of that. But I believe he said that it looks like the narrative biblically of Solomon is borrowing from Shalmaneser III or something, because the chariots described and all these like numbers of specific golden and silver and this and bronze or whatever it is that is listed. That's something that looks like it's taken from another source about Shalmaneser III. Because there wasn't this massive, we have an empire like Assyria or whatever. Maybe a house, a small village or something, you know? What about Solomon?
I mean, for sure existed. Right? But remember, the way, I'm trying to make the clear point that the way the Bible describes any of these people is not their historical reality. Right? Like, yes, if you were to tell me, I don't know if that's true, if you were to tell me that the description of Solomon borrows from the description of Shalmaneser III, that doesn't bother me at all. Like, if I were describing Solomon, why would I not borrow his, dude, Moses' birth story is taken from Sargon, right? Like, I mean, this stuff happens all over the place, right? Like, that's how you give prestige and power. You're like, yes, just like this other thing, just like this other known powerful thing. Or, that doesn't imply a lack of reality, right? Because the description of the person, again, right? George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. If I tell you that's fiction, it doesn't mean George Washington wasn't real. It means that particular depiction of his character, like Solomon didn't cut a baby in half. Like that story is meant to illustrate his wisdom. Like George Washington's cherry tree is supposed to illustrate his like honesty. It doesn't mean he didn't exist. Like none of those are it's a category error, right? To confuse the way that the Bible describes somebody with like, that's not true, therefore the person they're describing didn't exist. That doesn't work at any point in history, and certainly not for Solomon. Again, it's like, you know, I don't know how much. I think probably there are some aspects of the biblical accounts of David and Solomon, I am convinced, that are reflective of truths about their reigns, but none of it is going to be like, and that's literally what happened, right? And that's because that's not. They didn't write history. Like, they weren't historians writing modern day histories that are meant to account for the past exactly. That's a modern concept of what history is. Right? It's not native to their time or place. And to judge it on those bases, that's silly.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.